In this video, we're going to consider Thomas Aquinas' first article, and in this, he's considering the question whether the existence of God is self-evident. In this video, we're going to consider Thomas Aquinas' objection to the cosmological argument, and this is from pages 31 through 33 in our book. I've also posted it as a PDF online, and I'm sure that you've noticed that it's immediately before this video typed out. So one thing that you'll notice is that it's very short. I have cut out all of the parts that aren't necessary for the points that we're trying to look at, and so this should be a fairly straightforward reading. Okay, the setup for this argument is that Aquinas begins our reading by presenting an objection to St. Anselm's ontological argument. This is the argument that we looked at last week. In order to do this, however, he needs to clearly state what the argument is. And this, I think, is actually a really important thing to do in philosophy. If you're going to object to a view, it's really important to clearly state exactly what the view is. And so this is what's happening in objection 2 of the first article. So, to move on to the text, and as we normally do, I'll work through the text and we'll see that an argument emerges out of this. But as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it is at once seen that God exists. For by this word it is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, from this, we might already discover that we can get the first premise of the ontological argument that we looked at last week. So, by God, we mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, if you're paying careful attention, you might notice that there's a slight difference between this argument and the one that we saw last week. Right? So last week, God was understood as that than which nothing greater can be thought, and here we see Aquinas using the word conceived instead. So if you notice this and it's bothering you, I would just encourage you to set it aside and think about, in this case, thought and conceived to mean roughly the same thing until we've got the argument laid out. If after that you want to figure out exactly what the difference is, by all means, feel free. So to continue with the text. But as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it's at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. But that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. Therefore, since, as soon as the word God is understood, it exists mentally, it also follows that it exists actually. Therefore, the proposition, God exists, is self-evident. The rest of the text here leads to Aquinas' full version of the ontological argument. By God, we mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived. As soon as we understand the word God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, this understanding of God exists in us mentally, or in our mind. That which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. So, as soon as God exists in us mentally, he also then exists actually. And so, the proposition God exists is self-evident. So as I said, we might be interested in comparing this to Anselm's version of the ontological argument. So to remind us of exactly how that went, the first premise, God is that than which nothing greater. When we understand something, that thing exists in our understanding. So, God as that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in our understanding. But if God really is that than which nothing greater can be thought, then God must not only exist in our understanding, But he must also exist in reality, because if God didn't also exist in reality, there would be something greater, namely the being that existed both in our understanding and in reality. And this is a contradiction. And so, God must exist both in our understanding and in reality. So we may ask ourselves, are these two versions of the ontological argument the same? Now, there probably are some differences, but I think just in the interest of moving the discussion forward, for right now, we're going to accept that they are the same. Okay, now we'll move on to Aquinas' objection to this argument. So first I'll read the full text of the objection, and then we'll see from this that there's actually two objections that emerge, and then I'll consider each of those. Okay, here is the full text of Aquinas' objection. Perhaps not everyone who hears the word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. Yet, granted that everyone understands that by the word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. Okay, the first objection that comes from this. Perhaps not everyone who hears the word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. So, what's happening in this objection? So here's Aquinas' version of the ontological argument again, and what Aquinas is doing here with this part of the text is objecting to the first premise. So remember that the first premise is, by God, we mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? And what is Aquinas saying here? Perhaps not everyone who hears the word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, right? So what he's doing is he's saying that, look, maybe I understand something else by God other than that which by nothing greater can be conceived, right? So he even gives us a nice example. Some people have believed God to be a body, right? These people who believe God to be a body don't believe that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So notice that when you object to this first premise, right, the whole argument falls apart because we need that than which nothing greater can be conceived to make the fourth premise work. So the first part of Aquinas' objection is to object to the definition of God that we're using in the argument. Here's the second objection. Yet, granted that everyone understands that by the word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signified exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. Right. So notice here what Aquinas is doing is objecting to the fourth premise of the ontological argument. Right? And the fourth premise, to remind you, is that so, as soon as God exists in us mentally, then he also must exist actually. This is sort of the premise that forms the link between what's in our mind and what's in reality. And remember that the thing that's doing this is the fact that God is greater as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Right? So what Aquinas is saying here is that, look, I'll grant you that maybe by God we understand the word to mean something than which nothing greater can be thought, but even in this case, it doesn't mean that God has to necessarily exist, right? Because the person who doubts that God exists, for example, can understand that by God we mean that than which nothing greater can be thought, right? But still, precisely the thing that's under consideration is whether or not God exists. Okay, to summarize what happened in this video, we begin by considering Aquinas' objection to the ontological argument. In order to object to the argument, Aquinas first had to clearly present the argument, which he did a nice job of, and as I showed. We then compared this argument to Anselm's version of the ontological argument, and I suggested that I think that they're close enough to move the conversation forward. Then, Aquinas gave us two objections to the ontological argument. The first objection was to the first premise, and it claimed that we might mean something different by the word God. The second objection focused on the fourth premise, and this objected to the claim that just because the idea of God exists in our understanding, this idea must also exist in reality.